Hi, this is Ela Jarvis, and we are going to do the ultimate Technique-a-thon. We're going to do at least 15 techniques, which is more than we do in my normal beginning watercolor class. And one thing to keep in mind is that the quality of materials that you use will affect your results. So here is what happens when I do these techniques on studio watercolor paper from Blick, which is a wood pulp, versus if I use 100% cotton. This is my favorite brand, Arches Cold Press, and you can see how the paint just flows differently, right? How much more dramatic the colors are. The salt doesn't even show up here, whereas it really pops over here. So if you can get a better quality paper and some decent quality paint, I highly recommend that you go with those. And this can also be an interesting experiment for just comparing and contrasting how different products work. If you enjoy my videos, if you find these helpful, please consider joining my Patreon or supporting me on Ko-fi in the link in the doobly-doo below. And I hope you find this really helpful. So let's get started. Whenever you paint a picture, you start off with dry paint and you put some drops of water on whatever colors you're going to use. And I'm going to use two colors. I'm going to do green and kind of an orangey tomato red. And these are going to soften and become more gooey. So the first, I'm going to put paint on the top, coloring it in very quickly, not outlining, letting it be super wet. I keep dipping my brush back into my palette to make sure that I have plenty of paint on here. Then I rinse out my brush, and you can see how it's just flowing into that water. There's no hard line here. It's very soft. That's wet to wet technique with just one color of paint and water. For number 2, you're going to do wet into wet paint dots on a wet surface. By the way, I did add some thin masking tape just so that I don't have to worry about these two sides. We want to keep them separate. So for this one, you get the whole rectangle wet with clear water. My brush is very wet. Keep dipping it back in water to cover the whole thing. And I can tilt my paper and I look for any dry spots, maybe up here a little bit. And then I immediately, while it's still very wet, you don't want to go to the bathroom or walk away. You want to immediately go in with some dots and see how they flow. I'm adding more water to my green so that I have plenty. For number 3, I'm doing wet into wet and I'm doing water dots on top of the paint. I want this to be fairly concentrated because I'm going to put water on top of it and I want it to show. This is still wet into wet technique because everything's very wet and juicy. Now I'm going to rinse out my brush. And I have water on my brush and I can go dot, dot. So there we go, still wet into wet, but it's the water pushing the paint instead of the paint pushing on the water. If you find that it doesn't push as much as you want to, you dry out your brush on a paper towel and you can soak up some of that paint. And then sometimes I like to add just a little bit of water on top. So you're removing the paint and then adding even more water. So removing the paint, drying it, rinsing out your brush. Without drying it, put that water on there and then it will be quite light. On number 4, we're going to do salt. And you can use regular Morton's iodized salt. So for this, once again, I'm going to keep adding more water and stirring around. And if the paint looks too dry and too dark here, I dip my brush into water and then I can spread the paint around. Now here's the rule with salt. The tendency is to want to take a lot. That's too much. I want to take a pinch and I'm going to drop about half of that pinch back into my hand. And now I can sprinkle just tiniest bit. We're not flavoring our food, we're making a painting. And you can see each individual grain. There's no big clumps. You won't see the effect until we've waited a few minutes. Number 5, we're back into wet technique. We're going to be doing 2 colors. So I activated this orangey color here. This is going to be a very dramatic combination. Doing complementary colors. These are opposite on the color wheel. It's a very strong color. Rinse it off in my water. Dry off my brush. And then I go back into my green. Now I connect the two together while they're still wet. I'm going to make an interesting sort of tobacco-y brownish color. Fun. If I had done a pinkish red and blue, I could have gotten a purple. Or if I'd done a yellow and blue, I could have gotten a green. It'll be fun to see what you do. Already we're beginning to see the salt react. You see those little dots? So the salt is dissolving and it's pushing against the pigment in the paint. So we're doing this technique again, wet into wet with 2 colors, but with dots. So let's see, I'm gonna go with the green in the background. This is sap green, by the way, by Van Gogh. You can see the Van Gogh right there. This dot, this red is really going to pop. There we go. If you get a really big drop on there, you can get a bigger reaction. If you have less paint on your brush, you're gonna get smaller dots. That's really pretty. You can really see how red and green really react and have an intense effect when you put them together because they are complementary. The next one is wax. Here's my candle right here, and I can do a flat, broad stroke if I just want to have a big area that shows texture, or if I want, I can use a corner here and get a sharper line, and you don't really know what it's going to look like. So you can see where I scribbled that wax on there. It's resisting. If I lift this up a little bit, and I didn't push as hard right there. There it is, it's coming back. So you can sometimes help the wax along a little bit if it's too much paint. I rinse it out in water. I dry it on the paper towel, and then you can scrub back just a little bit. The next one I'm going to do is masking fluid. I'm pretty happy with Pebo, P-E-B-E-O. They call it drawing gum, but it's masking fluid. I do like the fine line masking fluid pen. It does sometimes clog. It does take some practice to get the type of line you want, and the fluid comes out of this tube, and it's hard to see, but there's a needle in that lid. The masking fluid comes out. It's basically latex, and I can draw with it. There it is. Trying to get a thin line is a little tricky. Sometimes you get bubbles in there. And then you can also, the container like this, and I'll go ahead, you can use a toothpick, but I'm going to use this tool because I own it. Every place where this gooey stuff is will protect the paper. And once this dries, I can paint watercolor on top of it. And then I let the watercolor dry. And then I can remove this masking fluid with an eraser. And it's a really cool effect. And we'll come back to this one later. This next one is a lot of fun, but it's kind of messy. I'm going to do a splatter with a paintbrush. So I'm going to protect these other areas with some paper. I've got a loaded up brush here, and I'm going to flick the paint onto this rectangle, and I'm going to stick out my finger, and I have to keep my grip loose. If I'm tight, the brush isn't going to bounce. So I'm holding it really loosely, and you can see those drops are falling onto the paper, and they kind of want to go everywhere. Now I'm going to do this technique again with a toothbrush, and once again I'm going to protect these areas with some scratch paper, and I'm going to get my toothbrush wet in water, and then I'm going to go ahead and dip it into a color, and now I'm going to flick it onto some big drops. There we go. So now we've got like more of a spray effect. So kind of hard to control, but really cool looking. So you can see it looks different than the splatter, but it's the same basic technique. Now I'm going to do something called dry brush, which just means I have to make sure that my paper is dry here to do this. So I've got my paintbrush, and I don't want it to be too wet. I want to load it up with a lot of pigment, but not a lot of water, right? So you want really concentrated paint, and then I'm wiping my brush on the edge to try and dry it out a little bit. And now I'm going to lay my brush flat and just run it over that texture, and you can see how it just picks up that texture on the paper. This technique doesn't work very well at all on smooth paper. You need paper that has texture for this to really work. And sometimes this will happen if you're painting and you're just running out of paint on your brush. If I dry out my brush a little bit more, you know, it's just going to happen automatically. If you start getting this effect when you don't want it, it's time to dip your brush back into your paint. The next technique is glazing. This is something we do a lot when we paint with watercolor. And the main trick is to start off with your lightest and most diluted color. So I'm going to start with yellow. I'm going to let this dry and come back to it. So this next one says straw on it. So you can literally use a straw. Here's a metal one. Random effects by putting a big blob of paint. And then with your straw, you can blow. So number 14 is alcohol, but I'm just going to use regular rubbing alcohol today. So you get an area nice and wet with paint, and while it's still wet, I have my rubbing alcohol here. I'm just going to dip the Q-tip and see what happens. It's going to push away the paint, and it's also going to dry much more quickly. You can also take like a small cap and dip it in the alcohol. Whoop. What happens then? Kind of cool. Now the last one here you see says plastic. Lay it down there. And I take a piece of plastic and I crumple it up and then I put it on top. And I want to weigh it down with something. I'm going to use this salt container. I'm just going to put it right on top. It's going to hold it in place. So this has all had a couple of hours to dry, and now we're going to see what everything looks like. So let's check out what this plastic did. Oh, that's much more dramatic. Very cool. So it kind of gathered in some parts and pressed the paint out of the way in others. So you can see here's two examples of what happened. So this was like a cling wrap, and this was a much stiffer Ziploc bag. And now we're going to paint on here. Let's see, this is the masking fluid, reactivating that same color again. And you can see it's still pretty juicy and wet. And this is going to have to dry again before I can take the masking fluid off. And then we have this very pale yellow here. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a fairly diluted blue. Don't want to make it too strong in this case because that yellow is not really strong. But if I paint this blue over the yellow, you can see through the blue. And what you're going to get is like an interesting sort of green that's a mixture of the two colors. You can see that this color is different than this or this. You can go with that reddish color again. I like to put the paint in a clean area of my palette. And I dip my brush in water and stir it around some more and make sure that my brush is really evenly coated. And let's see, is that, I want it to be transparent. I could just dip my brush in water to make it even more transparent. I can dip back into my palette, make it more concentrated again. So this is glazing. While this is still wet, I'm going to show you what happens if I scrape wet paint with a sharp tool like a needle or a pin. It makes it kind of darker. Sometimes you can get a little bit of white popping up. And then I can also try it on a dry area, like up here. I'm going to get more white. It's not going to darken because you don't have that water moving and soaking into that area, but it's an effect. So I'm going to remove the masking fluid, which is all dry now. So I think less is more. If it's too thin, it won't work, but if it's too thick, then it won't come off. So that's pretty cool. It's hard to control and make it perfect. Another interesting tool. If you do want a really, really precise white detailed line, get a pen or get some gouache. Sometimes these pens behave better than others. You don't want to press too hard or the line will begin to divide. But you can get really thin, fine white marks if you do want detail that you can add later. There it is, Signo, S-I-G-N-O, by Uniball, U-N-I-B-A-L-L. Most of the time when I paint with watercolor, I don't use any white paint. But every once in a while, I want some detail. So you can go back in and just add a little bit of white after the fact. The watercolor police will not arrest you. A giant, giant tube of Holbein Artist Squash in permanent white. This is Winsor & Newton's designer gouache called permanent white. Both of these contain titanium. That is the pigment that they use. And I like to use it straight from the tube. It doesn't reconstitute as easily as watercolor paint. Another fun tool is a sponge. I cut this sponge up and now I got it wet and I can dip it in some paint, make a pattern, some texture, bark or something that had texture, you can do it, or maybe a cloud if you did this with the white gouache. That would be fun. This is my final thing, a magic eraser. I dipped this corner in the water and now I want to remove some paint. Look at that. You can see there it is on there. I'm going to squeeze it small. Still not super tiny or exact. But if you did want to lighten up your painting, kind of like over here, but do it after your paint has dried, it is possible. And Target has started making their own generic version of this sponge. Just make sure there's no soap or added scent or anything to them. There it is, man. Look at all that. Let's do a little memory lane here. We've got wet into wet, just water and paint. And then I put some sponge texture and a little bit of white pen on top. Got everything wet with just clear water and put some dots on top. Got the whole thing green with color and then put the water on top. White gouache there. Here's salt. You can see what a cool effect that is. Here is wet into wet with two colors. So while it's wet, you add the second color. And I removed some of that paint with my magic eraser. Got everything wet with green paint and I put those red dots on top while it was still wet, so they're all kind of blurry. Wax from a candle on here and painted over it so the wax resisted in those areas where I scribbled. Masking fluid, not an exact art, but still it's a neat effect. Splatter with a paintbrush. Splatter from a toothbrush with some big blobs over there. Here's a dry brush, a brush with just a tiny bit of paint on it rubbed on its side. Here we have glazing, so yellow underneath, let it dry, and then blue on top to make this color, and then red on top. And then while these are wet, I scratched into them with the pin, and then here it is scratching onto dry paint. This is wet paint with a scratch and dry paint with a scratch. Here I am blowing paint with a straw. And then here is alcohol. I used a lid here, or a Q-tip here, and here's plastic. I just crumbled up the plastic and weighed it down with a heavy object and let it dry for a really long time, I'd say at least an hour. So congratulations if you've made it to the end of this video. This is a long one. I hope you play around with these different techniques, and if you watch more of my videos, you'll see how I use some of these techniques in my paintings. All right. Take care.